Handcuffs clicked shut on the rain-slicked highway, locking around the wrists of a man who usually dealt in shadows and suppressed sniper fire. Chief Petty Officer Dalen Reynolds had survived the deadliest valleys of Afghanistan, so the arrogant taunts of two small-town cops barely registered. They thought they'd snagged an easy mark, a quiet man they profiled on a lonely stretch of road at 2 in the morning. But as Reynolds sat in the cramped cruiser, perfectly calm, he knew something they didn't. They hadn't arrested a nobody. They had illegally caged a Tier 1 Navy SEAL, and the entire United States military was about to make them pay. The rain slicked the asphalt of Route 119, turning the winding 2-lane road into a treacherous mirror reflecting the headlights of a lone 2018 Ford F-150. Behind the wheel sat Dalen Reynolds, 32 years old, broad-shouldered, and entirely at peace in the quiet isolation of the cab. He had been back stateside for less than 48 hours, having just completed a grueling, classified 8-month deployment with SEAL Team 6. His body was battered, carrying the invisible bruises of high-altitude jumps and the deep, marrow-deep exhaustion that only elite operators know. All he wanted was the warmth of his bed in his secluded cabin in Ashwood, a sleepy Virginia town a few hours' drive from the naval bases on the coast. He was driving exactly the speed limit, 45 miles per hour. His hands rested lightly on the wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. The radio played a low, rhythmic jazz tune, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of rotor blades and gunfire that still echoed faintly in his memories. Suddenly, the interior of his truck was bathed in a violent, strobing wash of red and blue light. Dalen's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. A local Ashwood Police Department cruiser was riding his bumper, close enough that Dalen could see the aggressive posture of the driver. Dalen let off the gas, signaled his intention, and smoothly pulled onto the gravel shoulder, bringing the truck to a gentle stop. He put the vehicle in park, turned off the engine, rolled down his window, and placed both hands firmly on top of the steering wheel. It was a practiced, deliberate series of movements designed to convey absolute compliance. In the cruiser, Officer Mitchell Brody aggressively shoved his door open, stepping out into the drizzle. Brody was 26, a former high school linebacker who had traded his football jersey for a badge, bringing all his pent-up aggression and none of the discipline with him. His partner, Sergeant Thomas Griggs, a 20-year veteran with a cynical streak and a habit of looking the other way, when his junior officers crossed the line, followed at a slower, heavier pace, unhooking the flashlight from his belt. Brody approached the driver's side, his hand resting conspicuously on the butt of his service weapon. He shone his heavy maglite directly into Dalen's eyes, a blinding beam meant to disorient and intimidate. License, registration, and proof of insurance. Now, Brody snapped, his voice tight with an unearned authority. Dalen blinked through the blinding light, his voice calm, deep, and utterly devoid of fear. "Good evening, officer. They are in the glove compartment. I will need to reach over to get them. Is that all right?" Brody sneered, leaning closer to the window. "I didn't ask for a conversation. Boy, I told you to hand him over." The racial microaggression, the deliberate use of the word boy, hung in the damp air. Dalen's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but his heart rate didn't elevate a single beat. He had been insulted by warlords and interrogated under mock capture scenarios by the best in the business. A power-tripping rookie cop was nothing. "I am informing you of my movements, so there are no misunderstandings," Dalen replied evenly. He slowly reached across the cab, popped the glove box, and retrieved the small leather wallet containing his documents. He handed them through the window. Brody snatched them away, flashing the light over the Virginia driver's license. "Dalen Reynolds," Brody read, butchering the pronunciation slightly, deliberately dragging out the syllables. "What are you doing out here at 2 in the morning, Dalen?" "I'm driving home. I live about 4 miles up the road on Creek Hollow. Is that right?" Sergeant Griggs chimed in from the passenger side of the truck, shining his own light into the empty cab, looking for any excuse, a stray bottle, a suspicious package. "Don't see a lot of your kind living up on Creek Hollow. Pretty expensive real estate." "I saved my money," Dalen said simply. "Step out of the vehicle," Brody commanded, taking a step back and unfastening the safety strap on his holster. Dalen didn't move immediately. For what reason, officer? I was obeying the speed limit. My vehicle is in working order. I said step out of the damn vehicle, Brody shouted, his temper flaring instantly at the perceived defiance. You matched the description of a suspect involved in a break-in 2 towns over. Now get out before I drag you out. It was a blatant lie. Dalen knew it. Griggs knew it. Brody knew it. But on a dark, lonely road, the truth was whatever the men with the badges decided it was. I am stepping out of the vehicle, Dalen stated. He opened the door with his left hand, keeping his right hand visible, and stepped out into the rain. He stood at his full height, 6'2", built like a brick wall, possessing a coiled, lethal grace that was impossible to hide. Brody took a reflexive half-step back, intimidated by Dalen's sheer physical presence. To overcompensate for his sudden spike of fear, Brody lunged forward, grabbing Dalen's arm roughly and spinning him around to face the truck. Hands on the roof, spread your legs, Brody barked. Dalen complied, placing his palms flat against the cold, wet metal. He allowed Brody to kick his legs apart. Brody performed a rough, invasive pat-down, his hands lingering maliciously, searching for anything he could use. He found nothing but a wallet and a set of keys. Nothing on him, Mitch, Griggs said lazily, leaning against the bed of the truck. Probably just write him a ticket for a cracked taillight, and let's go get coffee. No, Brody said, his pride wounded by how unfazed Dalen was. He's acting suspicious. Too calm. I'm searching the vehicle. I do not consent to a search of my vehicle, Dalen said loudly and clearly, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. You have no probable cause. Brody spun Dalen around, shoving him back against the truck. I don't need your damn permission. You're a suspect in a felony burglary. Officer Brody, Dalen said, reading the name tag. If you search that vehicle without a warrant or probable cause, you will be violating my Fourth Amendment rights. Furthermore, I advise you to look at the secondary ID in my wallet before you escalate this any further. Brody laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Oh, you're a lawyer now? Let's see this magic ID. Brody flipped open Dalen's wallet, ignoring the driver's license, and pulled out the solid white card tucked behind it. It was a United States Uniformed Services Privilege and Identification Card, a military ID. Brody squinted at it, then let out a scoff. Chief Petty Officer? Navy? Yeah, right. I've seen better fakes pulled off college freshmen trying to buy cheap beer. That is a federal identification card, Dalen warned, his tone shifting from polite to a low, dangerous register. Confiscating or destroying it is a federal offense. Shut your mouth, Brody yelled, his face turning red. In a fit of sheer, arrogant stupidity, Brody bent the military ID, tossing it onto the wet floorboard of his cruiser. You're under arrest for resisting a lawful order and suspicion of burglary. Put your hands behind your back. Dalen stared at Brody. He could break the officer's arm in 3 places before Griggs could even unholster his weapon. He could disable both men, take their keys, and be gone in seconds. The kinetic pathways fired in his brain, mapping out the tactical takedown. But he was a professional. He was a sworn defender of the Constitution. Even when its enforcers were failing it so miserably, escaping wasn't the mission. The mission was survival. And then, accountability. Slowly, Dalen brought his hands behind his back. Brody slapped the steel cuffs on violently, ratcheting them down as tight as they could go, the metal biting painfully into Dalen's wrists. Dalen didn't wince. He didn't make a sound. He simply locked eyes with Brody, an icy, dead calm stare that made the young officer's stomach suddenly twist with a strange, inexplicable dread. Get in the car, Brody muttered, shoving Dalen toward the back of the cruiser. As Dalen sat in the cramped, hard plastic back seat, the rain drumming on the roof, he took a slow, deep breath. He wasn't afraid. He was calculating. They had taken his freedom. They had insulted his service, and they had laid hands on him. The karma was going to be biblical. The Ashwood Police Department was a relic of the 1980s, smelling strongly of stale coffee, industrial floor wax, and old sweat. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a persistent, headache-inducing hum. When Brody and Griggs dragged Dalen through the back doors and into the booking area, the night shift desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named Miller, barely looked up from his computer screen. "What do we got, Mitch?" Miller asked, stifling a yawn. "Caught a live one on 119, Brody boasted, shoving Dalen toward the booking counter. Matched the description of the Franklin house burglary. Got combative when I asked for his ID. Resisting arrest, failure to comply, and possession of a forged federal document." Miller paused his typing and looked up, his eyes sweeping over Dalen. He noted the soaked clothes, the tight handcuffs, and the utterly impassive expression on the prisoner's face. Forged federal document? Griggs tossed Dalen's wallet onto the counter, along with the military ID Brody had tossed into the cruiser earlier. "Kid had a fake Navy card. Says he's a chief petty officer. Look at him, Miller. Does he look like a Navy chief to you?" Miller picked up the ID card. He turned it over in his hands, squinting at the holographic overlay and the microprinting. "I don't know, Mitch. This looks pretty damn real to me. The chip is embedded right. The ghost image. It's a fake, Miller," Brody insisted, stepping into Miller's space. "I bought fake IDs in college that looked better. He's just some thug trying to use a stolen valor trick to get out of a ticket. Book him." Dalen stood in silence. His wrists were throbbing where the metal cuffs had cut off circulation, his hands growing cold and numb. Yet, his posture remained impeccable, back straight, shoulders squared, eyes forward. He was employing a mental technique he had used during SERE: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. Training. Detaching his mind from his physical discomfort, observing the room as a sterile, tactical environment. "Empty your pockets, tough guy," Brody ordered, finally unlocking the handcuffs, only to immediately shove Dalen against the counter. Dalen methodically removed his watch, a heavy, matte black tactical Garmin, his keys, and the loose change in his pockets. He placed them on the counter. "Take off your shoelaces and your belt," Miller instructed, going through the routine motions. As Dalen unthreaded his belt, Griggs picked up the Garmin watch. "Nice piece of gear," the older cop muttered. "Probably stolen. That watch was issued to me by Naval Special Warfare Command," Dalen said, his voice echoing in the quiet booking room. It was the first time he had spoken since they arrived. The absolute certainty and authority in his voice made all three cops pause for a fraction of a second. Brody recovered first, laughing mockingly. "Naval Special Warfare? What, you're a Navy SEAL now? First you're a chief, now you're a SEAL? What's next? You're an astronaut." Dalen didn't reply. He handed his belt and shoelaces to Miller. "Fingerprints and mugshot," Miller said, sighing. They ran him through the humiliating process. Dalen allowed them to press his fingers onto the digital scanner. When he stood for the mugshot, holding the black board with his temporary booking number, he stared directly into the camera lens. He didn't scowl. He didn't look defeated. He looked through the lens, his eyes promising a reckoning. "Put him in cell 3, Brody said, grabbing Dalen by the bicep. "Let him cool his heels until arraignment tomorrow morning. Maybe a night on concrete will make him a little more talkative." Cell 3 was a 6x8 concrete box containing a stainless steel toilet and a metal bench bolted to the wall. The door slammed shut with a heavy, metallic clang that echoed down the cell block. Dalen sat on the cold metal bench. The temperature in the cell was hovering around 60 degrees, and his clothes were still damp from the rain. He closed his eyes and began to control his breathing. In for 4 seconds, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. Box breathing. Within minutes, his core temperature stabilized, and his heart rate dropped to a steady, resting rhythm. He thought about his commanding officer, Vice Admiral Richard Sterling. Sterling was a man forged from pure iron, a legendary figure in the Spec Ops community who demanded absolute perfection from his men and offered absolute, unwavering loyalty in return. Sterling despised two things above all else: politicians who tied his operators' hands and anyone who disrespected the uniform. Dalen waited until the shift change at 6 a.m. A new deputy walked the line, handing out small, stale bologna sandwiches and tiny cartons of milk. "I am permitted one phone call," Dalen stated clearly to the young deputy. The deputy looked at his clipboard. "Yeah, all right, come on." Dalen was escorted to a wall-mounted phone in the hallway. He didn't call a civilian defense attorney. He didn't call a bail bondsman. He dialed a secure, unlisted number that routed directly to the Judge Advocate General's JAG office, attached to Naval Special Warfare Command in Virginia Beach. The line rang twice. "JAG Command, duty officer speaking. This is Chief Petty Officer Dalen Reynolds, designation Echo Sierra 7, Dalen said, his voice a low murmur. "I require legal assistance and command notification. I am currently being held at the Ashwood Municipal Police Department." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Chief Reynolds, can you repeat your location?" "Ashwood Police Department. I was arrested without probable cause during a traffic stop. They have confiscated my military identification and are holding me on fabricated charges of resisting arrest and burglary." "Are you injured, Chief?" "Negative. But they have my gear, and they are refusing to acknowledge my status." "Understood." "Chief," the duty officer's voice hardened instantly, the casual tone replaced by razor-sharp military efficiency. "Do not say another word to local law enforcement. Do not answer any questions. We are spinning up immediately. We will have a representative at your arraignment." "Thank you," Dalen said, and hung up. He walked back to his cell, escorted by the deputy. As the heavy door slammed shut again, Dalen allowed himself a very small, very grim smile. Officer Brody and Sergeant Griggs thought they had caught a stray wolf they could kick around for fun. They didn't realize they had just invited the entire pack to their front door. The Ashwood Municipal Courthouse was attached to the police station, a brick building that smelled of old wood polish and anxious sweat. At 9 a.m., the courtroom was packed with the usual morning docket. Petty thefts, traffic violations, drunk and disorderlies. Seated in the front row of the gallery, drinking coffee from styrofoam cups, were Officer Mitchell Brody and Sergeant Thomas Griggs. Brody was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. He loved arraignment mornings. He loved watching the people he had arrested shuffle in wearing orange jumpsuits, their bravado stripped away, looking to the judge for mercy. "Wonder if our fake Navy SEAL is going to cry when the judge denies bail." Brody chuckled, leaning over to Griggs. Griggs took a sip of his coffee. "Just make sure you have your testimony straight, Mitch. The resisting charge is solid, but the burglary link is thin. Doesn't matter." Brody waved him off. "He's a nobody. Public defender will plead him out to disorderly conduct. He'll take probation, and we get a conviction stat. Easy money." At the front of the room, the bailiff stood up. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Penelope Davies presiding. Judge Davies, a stern woman in her late 50s with sharp features and a no-nonsense reputation, took the bench. She adjusted her glasses, opened the thick file folder in front of her, and began calling cases. For the first hour, the routine played out exactly as Brody expected. Deals were made, fines were levied, court dates were set. Then, the bailiff read the next name, case number 44-092. State of Virginia versus Dalen Reynolds. Charges: resisting arrest, failure to comply with a lawful order, and suspicion of burglary. The heavy wooden door leading to the holding cells opened. Dalen Reynolds walked in. He was wearing the standard-issue bright orange county jail uniform. His hands were shackled in front of him, the chain connecting to a belly band. Despite the chains, despite the ridiculous color of the uniform, he didn't shuffle. He walked with a measured, predatory grace, his spine perfectly straight. He didn't look at the floor. He didn't look at the gallery. He looked dead ahead, stopping exactly at the defense table. Brody nudged Griggs. "Look at him. Still thinks he's a tough guy." Judge Davies looked down at her file, then peered over her glasses at Dalen. "Mr. Reynolds, you are appearing today without representation. Given the severity of the charges, I strongly advise you to request a public defender." Before Dalen could speak, The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. The murmur of the courtroom instantly died. Striding down the center aisle was a woman in a pristine, perfectly pressed Navy service dress blue uniform. The gold oak leaf of a lieutenant commander gleamed on her collar, and the JAG Corps insignia was pinned above her left breast pocket. Her black heels clicked sharply, rhythmically against the hardwood floor. She carried a slim, black, leather briefcase. Brody frowned, sitting up straighter in his chair. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. The JAG officer walked straight past the gallery, past the wooden divider, and stopped beside Dalen. She turned to the judge. "Good morning, Your Honor. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins, United States Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps. I am formally entering my appearance as defense counsel for Chief Petty Officer Dalen Reynolds." Judge Davies blinked, clearly taken aback. She looked from the immaculate naval officer to the man in the orange jumpsuit. "Commander Jenkins? This is a municipal court. The defendant is a civilian facing state charges. With respect, Your Honor, the defendant is not a civilian," Commander Jenkins stated, her voice projecting clearly to the very back of the room. "Chief Petty Officer Reynolds is an active duty member of the United States Navy, specifically attached to Naval Special Warfare Development Group. He is federal property, and his arrest last night was not only entirely without merit, but it represents a gross violation of his civil rights and interference with federal military readiness." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. In the front row, Brody's smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden, cold weight in his stomach. Griggs sat frozen, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth. "Naval Special Warfare?" Judge Davies repeated, her tone shifting. She looked down at the arresting officer's report. The arresting officer's notes indicate that the defendant was carrying a forged military identification card. Commander Jenkins reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed, manila envelope. She approached the bench and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "Enclosed, Your Honor, are Chief Reynolds' verified service records, his active duty status confirmation, directly from the Pentagon, and an affidavit from his command, verifying that the identification card seized by Officer Brody is, in fact, authentic." Jenkins paused, turning slightly to cast a withering glare at Brody and Griggs. "An identification card that, I might add, is federal property and was illegally confiscated." Judge Davies broke the seal on the envelope and quickly scanned the documents. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the service record. She looked back up at Dalen, the annoyance in her eyes entirely replaced by a sudden, profound respect. "Officer Brody," Judge Davies said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy level. "Stand up." Brody swallowed hard, his legs trembling slightly as he stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Your report states you pulled the defendant over for suspicion of burglary. You then state he became combative and produced a fake ID. I am currently holding a document signed by the Department of Defense confirming this man is a highly decorated Navy SEAL." Judge Davies leaned forward over the bench. "Would you like to explain to me how a Tier 1 military operator, returning from a classified deployment, ended up in my courtroom in shackles because of your traffic stop?" "Aye, Your Honor." "He fit the description," Brody stammered, his face turning pale, "and the ID looked fake to me. I was just doing my job." "Your job," Commander Jenkins interrupted smoothly, "does not include violating the Fourth Amendment, Officer Brody, nor does it include mocking a decorated veteran and tossing a federal ID onto the floor of your cruiser." "That's a lie," Brody blurted out, panic setting in. "He's making that up, is he?" Jenkins asked calmly. "Your Honor, I have already submitted a preservation order for the dashcam and bodycam footage from Officer Brody's cruiser, as well as the audio recordings from the booking room. I expect those to be surrendered to federal investigators by the end of the day." Brody felt the blood drain completely from his face. He looked at Griggs, but the older sergeant had shrunk down in his seat, desperately trying to become invisible. The bodycam footage. Brody had forgotten to turn it off during the arrest. Every insult, the rough handling, the dismissal of the ID, it was all on tape. Judge Davies slammed her file shut. "I am releasing the defendant immediately on his own recognizance, and I am issuing an order for Ashwood Police Department to return all of Chief Reynolds' personal property this instant." She glared at Brody. "Officer, I suggest you retain a very good attorney, because it appears you have just stepped on a landmine." "Thank you, Your Honor," Jenkins said. But the drama was far from over. As the bailiff stepped forward to unlock Dalen's handcuffs, a deep, rhythmic rumbling vibrated through the floorboards of the courthouse. It was a heavy, mechanized sound, growing louder by the second. Outside the courthouse windows, the street was suddenly blocked off. Two dark green military Humvees had pulled up directly onto the curb, their heavy tires crushing the manicured grass. Behind them, a sleek black Chevrolet Suburban with government plates parked squarely in the middle of the street, blocking traffic in both directions. The courtroom doors opened once again, and this time, the silence that fell over the room was absolute, suffocating in its intensity. Two heavily armed Navy Master-at-Arms personnel stepped into the room, scanning the crowd with professional, unblinking eyes. They took positions on either side of the doorway. Following them was a man who seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He wore a perfectly tailored Navy service dress blue uniform. The sleeves of his jacket were thick, with gold braiding, and a brilliant array of ribbons covered his chest. Above the ribbons was the gold trident of a Navy SEAL. But it was the 3 silver stars gleaming on his collar that made every police officer in the room break out in a cold sweat. Vice Admiral Richard Sterling had arrived. He didn't walk. He advanced. He moved with the undeniable authority of a man who commanded fleets, who authorized strikes that changed the geopolitical map, and who viewed the men under his command as his own sons. His face was weathered, his eyes a piercing, stormy gray that locked immediately onto the man in the orange jumpsuit. Sterling walked past the gallery, ignoring the shocked gasps and whispers. He stopped at the wooden divider, right behind Officer Brody, who was still standing, frozen in terror. Sterling didn't even look at the cop. He looked directly at Dalen. "Chief Reynolds," Admiral Sterling said, his voice deep, gravelly, and echoing with command. Dalen immediately snapped his heels together. Even in shackles and an orange jumpsuit, his posture locked into a rigid, perfect position of attention. "Admiral." Sterling looked at the heavy chains binding Dalen's wrists. He looked at the orange fabric. Then, slowly, terrifyingly, he turned his head and looked at Officer Mitchell Brody. "Are you the individual?" Admiral Sterling asked, his voice deathly quiet. "Who put my chief in chains?" The karma hadn't just arrived. It had brought a fleet. The silence in the Ashwood Municipal Courthouse was no longer just quiet. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the lungs of every civilian and police officer in the room. The air conditioning hummed, a pitifully weak sound against the sheer, radiating authority of Vice Admiral Richard Sterling. Officer Mitchell Brody, who had strutted into the courtroom an hour earlier feeling like the king of his small, miserable kingdom, now looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the lever being pulled. His mouth opened and closed silently, his vocal cords paralyzed by the icy, unblinking glare of the 3-star Admiral. "I asked you a question." "Officer," Admiral Sterling's voice rumbled, soft but carrying the lethal promise of an incoming artillery strike. "Are you the man who placed Chief Petty Officer Dalen Reynolds in those chains?" I. Brody swallowed violently, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked desperately at Judge Penelope Davies, then at his partner, Sergeant Griggs, who had sunk so low in his chair he was practically under the wooden barrier. Finding no lifeline, Brody choked out, "Yes, sir." Sterling's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. "I am a Vice Admiral in the United States Navy, officer. You will address me as Admiral." "Yes, Admiral," Brody whispered, his face completely drained of blood. Sterling didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He turned his attention to the bench, his posture perfectly rigid. "Judge Davies, I apologize for the disruption to your courtroom. However, I am here under the authority of the Department of Defense. Chief Petty Officer Reynolds holds a top-secret, sensitive compartmented information clearance. He is a critical asset to national security. The fact that local law enforcement detained him, ignored his federal identification, and held him in a municipal cell without immediately notifying the military is a catastrophic breach of protocol, and the fact that they did it based on his race is a stain on the uniform they wear. Judge Davies, who had presided over Ashwood for 15 years and thought she had seen every flavor of human stupidity, looked utterly appalled. She pointed a trembling finger at the bailiff. "Bailiff, remove those shackles this instant. Get those chains off that man." The bailiff, a heavy-set man in his 50s, practically sprinted across the well of the courtroom. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the heavy belly chain and the tight steel cuffs. The metal clattered loudly to the hardwood floor. Dalen rubbed his wrists slowly. Deep, red grooves were permanently etched into his dark skin where the metal had bitten in for hours. Yet, his expression remained perfectly neutral. He rolled his shoulders, stood at attention, and locked eyes with his commanding officer. "Chief Reynolds," Admiral Sterling said, the steel in his voice softening just a fraction, a micro-expression of profound respect passing between the two warriors. "Are you fit for duty?" "Always, Admiral," Dalen replied, his voice calm, deep, and steady. "Good." Sterling turned back to Brody. "Because the men you arrested thought they could break a man who has endured interrogations that would make them weep for their mothers. They thought they were predators. They are about to find out they are prey." Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins stepped forward, opening her black leather briefcase once more. "Your Honor, if I may, to compound the egregiousness of this arrest, I have just received an urgent transmission from the Virginia State Police, coordinated through our JAG investigators." Jenkins pulled out a crisp, single-page printout and handed it to the bailiff to pass to the judge. Officer Brody's sworn arrest report states that he pulled over Chief Reynolds because his vehicle matched the description of a suspect fleeing a burglary in neighboring Franklin County, Jenkins stated, her voice ringing out crisp and clear. "Your Honor, the document you are holding is the official dispatch log from Franklin County. The burglary in question occurred at 8:15 p.m. last night. The suspect was apprehended hiding in a shed behind the property at exactly 11:30 p.m. The courtroom erupted into shocked whispers. Judge Davies' eyes widened as she read the paper. Jenkins turned slowly to look at Brody, delivering the final, crushing blow. Chief Reynolds was pulled over by Officer Brody at 2:15 a.m., almost 3 hours after the burglary suspect was already in a jail cell. Furthermore, the apprehended suspect is a 54-year-old Caucasian male driving a rusted 1998 Honda Civic. Chief Reynolds is a 32-year-old black man driving a pristine 2018 Ford F-150. Judge Davies slowly lowered the paper. The look she gave Officer Brody could have melted lead. "Officer Brody," she said, her voice shaking with raw, unfiltered fury. "You profiled a motorist, initiated an illegal traffic stop, fabricated probable cause, destroyed federal property, and then committed perjury on a sworn police report to cover your tracks." Brody was visibly trembling now, tears of panic welled in his eyes. "Your Honor, I made a mistake. It was dark, I thought. You thought you could get away with it," Judge Davies snapped, slamming her gavel down so hard the handle cracked. "This court will not tolerate rogue officers using their badges to terrorize innocent citizens, and we certainly will not tolerate the abuse of our nation's decorated service members." She pointed her gavel directly at Brody. "Bailiff, take Officer Mitchell Brody into custody. I am holding him in direct contempt of court, and I am recommending immediate charges of perjury, filing a false police report, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law." Brody let out a strangled gasp as the bailiff grabbed him by the arm, the exact same way Brody had grabbed Dalen hours earlier. "Wait, no, you can't do this. Griggs," Brody shrieked, looking desperately at his veteran partner. "Griggs, tell them we thought he was the guy." Sergeant Thomas Griggs stood up, his face pale, his hands raised in surrender. "Your Honor, I swear, I was just the passenger. I told Mitch to just write a ticket and let him go. I had nothing to do with this. He went rogue." Karma had come full circle. The brotherhood of the badge, the thin blue line Brody had hidden behind, dissolved instantly in the face of absolute, undeniable consequences. Save it for the federal investigators, Sergeant, Jenkins said coldly. We have the dashcam audio. You are an accessory. As Brody was dragged kicking and pleading toward the same holding cells Dalen had just vacated, Admiral Sterling stepped up to Dalen. The Admiral ignored the chaos of the courtroom. He reached out and firmly grasped Dalen's shoulder. Let's get you out of this orange rag, Chief, Sterling said quietly. Your gear is waiting, and we have a lot of work to do. The air outside the Ashwood Municipal Courthouse smelled of wet asphalt and ozone, a storm having just broken over the Virginia hills. The two military Humvees idled aggressively on the curb, their heavy diesel engines purring like caged beasts. A crowd of locals had already gathered on the sidewalks, cell phones out, filming the unprecedented display of federal power that had descended upon their sleepy town. Dalen Reynolds walked out the heavy glass double doors. He was no longer wearing the humiliating county orange. Commander Jenkins had brought a freshly pressed set of Navy working uniform, NWU. Type 3 camouflage. His gold chief's anchors gleamed on his collar, and the sealed trident was pinned securely to his chest. His heavy Garmin tactical watch was back on his wrist. He looked like exactly what he was, a lethal, disciplined operator. Following closely behind him were Admiral Sterling, Commander Jenkins, and a very breathless, deeply panicked man in a heavily starched white shirt, William Harrison, the chief of police for Ashwood. Chief Harrison had been pulled out of a mayoral breakfast meeting when his phone exploded with calls about the Navy invading his courthouse. Admiral Sterling, please. I beg you to understand, Chief Harrison pleaded, practically jogging to keep up with the Admiral's long strides. He was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. This is an isolated incident. Officer Brody is a bad apple, a rookie who let his ego get the better of him. The Ashwood Police Department has the utmost respect for the military. We support the troops. Admiral Sterling stopped dead in his tracks at the bottom of the courthouse steps. He turned slowly, towering over the portly police chief. Support the troops? Sterling repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Is that what you call it, Chief Harrison? Because from where I am standing, your department's version of supporting the troops involves dragging a decorated war hero out of his vehicle in the middle of the night, insulting his service, snapping his federal identification in half, and throwing him in a freezing concrete box to rot. I assure you, Admiral, Brody will be fired immediately. Stripped of his badge, he'll never work in law enforcement again. Harrison babbled, desperate to contain the radioactive fallout. You are damn right he will never work in law enforcement again, a new voice interrupted. A black Ford Explorer with tinted windows screeched to a halt right behind the Humvees. The doors opened, and three men in sharp, dark suits stepped out. The lead man, sporting silver hair and a stern, weathered face, flashed a gold badge clipped to his belt. Special Agent Robert Lynch, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Richmond Field Office. The man announced, walking directly up to Chief Harrison. Commander Jenkins contacted us 2 hours ago. We are officially opening a federal civil rights probe into the Ashwood Police Department under 18 U.S. Code, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. Chief Harrison looked like he was going to pass out. Agent Lynch, please, the FBI doesn't need to get involved. We can handle this internally. Your Internal Affairs Division is a joke, Harrison. Agent Lynch cut him off ruthlessly. We've been quietly monitoring your department for 6 months after a string of complaints regarding racial profiling on Route 119. You've been using that highway as a cash register, pulling over minorities and out-of-state plates to fund your municipal budget. But today your boys pulled over the wrong damn man. Agent Lynch turned to Dalen, extending his hand. Chief Reynolds, it is an honor to meet you, sir. I deeply apologize on behalf of federal law enforcement that you had to endure this in your own backyard. Dalen shook the agent's hand firmly. Thank you, Agent Lynch. I just want to go home. You will, Chief. Admiral Sterling said gently. But first, there is one last piece of business. Sterling turned back to Chief Harrison, who was now trembling visibly. I want to be unequivocally clear, Chief Harrison. I do not care about your apologies. I do not care about your public relations spin. I command men who jump out of perfectly good aircraft at 30,000 feet in the dead of night to eliminate the enemies of this nation. They endure unimaginable hardships so that people like you can sleep safely in your beds." Sterling took a step closer, invading Harrison's personal space, his eyes burning with a righteous, terrifying fire. "When my men come home, they are supposed to be safe. They are supposed to be respected." Chief Reynolds survived 6 combat deployments. He survived ambushes in the Korengal Valley. He should not have to survive a drive to his own house in Virginia because your officers cannot see past the color of his skin. Sterling pointed a rigid finger at the courthouse doors. "You will surrender all body cam footage, dash cam footage, dispatch logs, and radio transcripts to the FBI immediately. If I find out that a single second of tape has been deleted or a single document shredded, I will personally see to it that you are charged with obstruction of justice. The United States Navy is not going to let this go. We are going to bury you in so much federal litigation your town won't see daylight for a decade." "Yes, Admiral," Harrison stuttered, utterly broken. "Full cooperation. Whatever you need, get out of my sight." Sterling dismissed him with a look of pure disgust as Harrison scurried back toward the police station, flanked by the 2 junior FBI agents. Admiral Sterling turned to Dalen. The anger in the Admiral's face vanished, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. He stopped, squared his shoulders, and slowly, deliberately, snapped a crisp military salute. It was a staggering breach of protocol. Admirals do not salute enlisted men first, but it was a profound gesture of respect, an acknowledgement of the injustice Dalen had suffered. "Chief Reynolds," Admiral Sterling said loudly, ensuring everyone in the crowd could hear, "on behalf of the United States Navy, and on behalf of a nation that failed you last night, I offer my deepest and most sincere apologies. You deserved better, and I swear to you, we will make this right." Dalen, standing tall in his uniform, the morning sun catching the gold of his trident, returned the salute flawlessly. "Thank you, Admiral. Go home, Dalen," Sterling said softly, dropping his hand. "Take the week. That's a direct order. We'll handle the garbage disposal here." Dalen turned and walked toward the waiting black Suburban. The nightmare was over, but for Officer Mitchell Brody, Sergeant Thomas Griggs, and the corrupt system that had enabled them, the nightmare had just begun. The karma had arrived. It was wearing a suit, carrying a badge, and backed by the full, crushing might of the United States military. The dismantling of the Ashwood Police Department did not happen slowly. It happened with the terrifying, mechanized efficiency of a military strike. Within 48 hours of Dalen Reynolds walking out of the municipal courthouse, Special Agent Robert Lynch and a small army of forensic accountants, cybercrime specialists, and civil rights investigators from the FBI's Richmond field office descended upon the precinct. They didn't knock. They served federal, no-knock warrants, walking right past the stunned desk sergeants and taping off entire sections of the building with yellow crime scene tape. Chief William Harrison's desperate promise to handle things internally evaporated the moment Agent Lynch's cyber team seized the department's main servers. In a twist of sheer, panicked stupidity, Harrison had attempted to log into the administrative portal at 3 a.m., the night after the arraignment, to mass delete body cam footage from the past 6 months. He didn't realize that the FBI had already mirrored the entire server farm remotely an hour prior. Harrison's panicked keystrokes weren't a cover-up. They were an electronically signed confession to obstruction of justice, time-stamped and IP traced directly to his home computer. Meanwhile, inside the federal holding facility in Alexandria, former Officer Mitchell Brody was rapidly discovering that his small-town swagger had absolutely zero currency. He was stripped of his badge, his gun, and his freedom, trading his polyester uniform for a drab federal jumpsuit. His initial arrogance had morphed into a frantic, hyperventilating terror. Brody used his phone calls to contact every high-powered defense attorney in the state. Every single one turned him down. The moment they heard the names Vice Admiral Richard Sterling and Naval Special Warfare, the line invariably went dead. No lawyer with half a brain was going to stand in front of a jury and try to defend a racist, rogue cop who had illegally shackled a decorated Tier 1 operator. Brody was ultimately assigned a deeply exhausted federal public defender who took one look at the case file and advised him to plead guilty to save himself from a maximum sentence. Brody, still clinging to his delusions, refused. The dam truly broke on day 5 of the investigation. Sergeant Thomas Griggs, sweating profusely in a windowless FBI interrogation room, realized that the thin blue line he had protected for 20 years was a rapidly sinking ship. Sitting across from him were Agent Lynch and Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins, who was observing as a liaison for the Department of Defense. "I'm looking at 30 years of pension, Tom," Lynch said, tossing a thick, heavily redacted file onto the metal table. "And I'm looking at dashcam footage of you standing by while your rookie commits 3 federal felonies. But that's just Friday night. We've been digging into the last 5 years. We found the text messages. We found the fishing quotas." Griggs swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Commander Jenkins, whose face was a mask of cold, judicial fury. "The fishing quotas?" he croaked. "Don't play dumb," Lynch snapped. "You and Brody had a game. You called it Friday night fishing. Pulling over out-of-state plates and minority drivers on Route 119, using fake traffic infractions to search vehicles for cash, to seize under civil asset forfeiture. We have the impound logs. You were funding the department's new cruisers by robbing civilians at gunpoint." Lynch leaned forward, the harsh overhead light reflecting off his silver hair. "Harrison is going down for obstruction. Brody is going to federal prison for a very, very long time. You are currently the only man in this room who can still choose which side of the bars he sleeps on tonight. You flip on Brody. You testify to the culture of corruption Harrison fostered, and I'll talk to the U.S. Attorney about immunity for the civil rights charges. But your badge is gone." Today, Griggs looked at his hands. He was 52 years old. The thought of surviving a federal penitentiary as an ex-cop was a death sentence. The karma he had avoided for 2 decades had finally caught up, and it was demanding its toll. "Give me the paper," Griggs whispered, tears of profound defeat welling in his eyes. "I'll tell you everything. Brody." Brody thought he was untouchable. He hated the military guys coming through town, thought they looked down on him because he washed out of the Marine Corps boot camp. Commander Jenkins' eyes narrowed. That was the psychological twist. Brody's irrational hostility toward Dalen wasn't just racial profiling. It was rooted in a deep, pathetic insecurity. He had tried and failed to earn the uniform he so casually disrespected. The investigation became a slaughterhouse. With Griggs's recorded confession, the Justice Department filed a massive, sweeping indictment. It wasn't just Brody anymore. Chief Harrison was arrested in his driveway by armed federal agents in front of his neighbors. 3 other Ashwood officers were suspended pending federal review. The small, corrupt fiefdom was burning to the ground, and the fire was visible from Washington, D.C. 7 months later, the federal courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, felt less like a halls of justice and more like a military tribunal. The trial of the United States v. Mitchell Brody had become a national spectacle. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. But it wasn't the press that made Brody's blood run cold as he sat at the defense table. It was the gallery. The first 3 rows directly behind the prosecution were a sea of pristine Navy service dress blue uniforms. Dozens of active duty SEALs, Master-at-Arms, and JAG officers sat in absolute, terrifying silence. They didn't whisper. They didn't fidget. They simply stared at the back of Brody's head, an immovable wall of brotherhood and lethal discipline. In the center of the front row sat Vice Admiral Richard Sterling, his face carved from granite. Dalen Reynolds sat at the prosecution's table as the star witness. He wore his uniform, his chest heavy with the medals he had earned in the blood and dust of foreign lands. The trial was a masterclass in legal destruction. The federal prosecutor, guided by the tactical precision of Commander Jenkins, dismantled Brody piece by piece. They played the dashcam footage, the audio of Brody calling Dalen boy, the sickening sound of the federal ID snapping. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Brody mocked the very concept of naval special warfare. When Brody took the stand in his own defense, a Hail Mary passed by his desperate lawyer. It was a disaster. He tried to play the victim, claiming he was intimidated by Dalen's size and feared for his life. The prosecutor simply walked up to the podium, clicked a remote, and projected a still frame from the body cam onto the large screen. It showed Dalen, hands placed passively on the steering wheel, speaking calmly and respectfully. "Mr. Brody," the prosecutor asked smoothly, "you claim you feared for your life. Yet, in this exact moment, Chief Reynolds is informing you of his movements to ensure your safety. He is complying with every order. The only person escalating the situation, the only person using profanity, and the only person drawing a weapon is you. Is it not true that you targeted Chief Reynolds because you felt inadequate after failing out of basic training, and you wanted to humiliate a man who succeeded where you failed?" Brody's face flushed crimson. "Objection," his lawyer cried. "Withdrawn," the prosecutor said, smiling coldly. The damage was done. The jury had seen the truth. Brody wasn't a protector of the peace. He was a fragile, dangerous bully who had hidden behind a piece of tin. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When the foreman read the verdict, the words echoed like a final, fatal gunshot in the quiet room. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant, Mitchell Brody, guilty. On the charge of falsifying a federal document, guilty. On the charge of perjury, guilty. Federal Judge Arthur Pendleton, a man known for his merciless sentencing of corrupt officials, looked down at Brody. "Mr. Brody, you have disgraced the badge you wore," Judge Pendleton said, his voice booming through the sound system. "You took a man who has bled for this country, a man of impeccable character, and you subjected him to a nightmare born of your own prejudice and malice. You are a coward who abused the power entrusted to you by the public." Pendleton banged his gavel. "I sentence you to 180 months in federal prison, to be served consecutively, without the possibility of early parole. 15 years. Brody collapsed into his chair, sobbing uncontrollably, his hands covering his face. No one in the gallery moved. The SEALs simply stood up in unison, perfectly synchronized, and filed out of the courtroom. The message had been sent, and the karma was absolute. A month later, the town of Ashwood formally settled a sweeping civil lawsuit brought by Dalen Reynolds for $4.5 million. The police department was placed under a federal consent decree, completely overhauled by the Department of Justice, and Chief Harrison pleaded guilty to obstruction, earning himself 5 years in a minimum security facility. Dalen didn't keep a single cent of the settlement. On a crisp Tuesday morning, he walked into the headquarters of the Navy SEAL Foundation in Virginia Beach and quietly handed over a cashier's check for the entire amount. He didn't ask for a photo op. He didn't want a plaque. He simply wanted the money to go to the families of the brothers he had lost overseas. That evening, Dalen sat on the porch of his cabin in Ashwood. The rain had passed, leaving the Virginia air smelling of pine and damp earth. His 2018 Ford F-150 was parked in the driveway, gleaming under the twilight sky. He took a sip of black coffee, looking out over the quiet woods. The storm had come, it had raged, and it had broken against the unbreakable wall of his discipline. He was exactly where he belonged, at peace, at home, and ready for whatever mission came next. The ordeal of Chief Petty Officer Dalen Reynolds serves as a profound testament to the unyielding power of discipline over chaos and truth over malice. When confronted by the absolute worst of domestic authority, men cloaked in badges but driven by prejudice and fragile egos, Dalen relied on the very training that had kept him alive in the world's most unforgiving combat zones. He did not break. He calculated. The ensuing retribution wasn't an act of vengeance, but the magnificent, crushing weight of justice course-correcting a broken system. It reminds us that true strength is not found in volume or violence, but in the quiet dignity of a person who knows exactly who they are. The karma that decimated the corrupt Ashwood Police Department was a stark warning. Those who misuse their power to terrorize the honorable will eventually find themselves facing a force they cannot comprehend, let alone defeat.